Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Transforming Systems for Continued Poverty Reduction Success, with Rowan Burdge from BC Poverty Reduction, Scott MacAfee from the National Advisory Council on Poverty, and my name is Rochelle Ignacio, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director at Tamarack Institute. I'll be today's host, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Behind the scenes, we have Maureen Owens and Jamie, who will be offering technical support, so please reach out if you're running into any difficulties. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Indigenous land from across Turtle Island and beyond. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of and continue to take care of this land. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of the truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Personally, I'm calling in from Edmonton, which is home to the traditional lands of Treaty 6 and Métis Region 4, whose Indigenous name translates to Beaver Hills House. Treaty 6 is home to the Nehiyaw, Dene, Anishinaabe, Nakota Iska, and Niitsitapi peoples. I invite you to please use the chat box to introduce yourself, your organization, the lands you're calling in from, and what questions you might have what questions you might be bringing to today's call. We also have a Q&A feature that I'll talk about momentarily. So acknowledging traditional treaty areas helps us move beyond colonization and helps us strengthen the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I just did some research because I think it's really important that we move beyond just reading land acknowledgements and think about how it's important to the place that we're in. So I found a new study published this month titled Disaggregated Trends in Poverty from the 2021 Census of Population, and it's from the Census in Brief series, and it focused on the experiences of poverty in Canada in 2020 based on the 2021 census. And it examined disaggregated poverty trends by age, gender, family situation, immigrant status, and Indigenous identity, as well as for racialized groups. What I want to note in that report is that Indigenous people were one of the many groups identified who experience poverty and are at a higher risk of facing hardship due to periods of economic uncertainty, such as periods of reduced economic activity and elevated inflation. And we'll put a link to that report in the chat so you could check it out later. So I'm just going to go over some of the technical considerations. So if you are having any difficulties, just try exiting and re-entering the room. We do have a chat box, so like I said, you can use it to introduce yourself, engage in the discussion with one another. You can also, there's a Q&A box where you can submit questions directly, and you should have access to comment on questions and interact with the Q&A there as well. We will be sending out notes, slides in the recording after today's call, and we'll be having this call today in English, but we will be enabling closed captioning, and we are recording the webinar as well. So when we look at what we're going to be doing today, we're going to introduce the webinar and speakers momentarily. Then we're going to have about half an hour for some discussion between Rowan, Scott, and myself. And then we have time for some audience-generated Q&A before we close out. So the 2022 National Advisory Council on Poverty report was released last month with a desire to shape systems that will sustain and strengthen Canada's poverty reduction success. Today, our goal is to explore the engagement and consultations involved in preparing the report, learn more about how the Advisory Council addressed the needed transformation within systems through their report recommendations, and place an emphasis on equity through understanding how the system impacts individuals, which the report identified as groups made most marginal. I'd now like to invite Rowan, who is the Provincial Director of BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, to come off mute and introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Rowan Burdge, and I'm the Provincial Director of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm calling in today from the unceded, traditional, and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much to Tamarack for having me, and yeah, really looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, Rowan. And now I'd like to invite Scott, who is the chair of the National Advisory Council of Poverty. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks. I'm Scott MacAfee. I'm the chair of the National Advisory Council on Poverty. I am in Rowan's territory today. I come from the East Coast, the unceded unsurrendered lands of the Wolastoqey. But today I don't know the land, but I know I'm sitting on the same land as Rowan is, this unceded and stolen lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. Thank you. So I'm excited to be here today and to talk poverty reduction with everybody.
Thanks, Scott. So as I mentioned, my name's Rochelle Ignacio, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director for Tamarack. Tamarack is a connected force for community change, building the capacity of change makers in cities and communities within Canada and around the world. We catalyze collective action with diverse leaders to solve major community challenges, including ending poverty, building youth futures, deepening community, and addressing climate change. Our belief is that when we are effective in strengthening our collective capacity to engage residents and community members and lead collaboratively, our work contributes to building of peace and a more equitable society. One of our goals is to end poverty, which we believe is possible. And just to provide a little bit of information about me, I use she, her pronouns, and I grew up in rural Alberta in Treaty 6, and I moved to Edmonton to attend post-secondary, and I've made it my home. I'm a second generation Canadian. My parents came from the Caribbean in the 80s. And I believe in supporting organizational development of equity, diversity, inclusion in corporations and government. And I have a community background specifically within Edmonton's Black community. So we're going to get into the fun part where we're getting into the conversation between Rowan, Scott, and myself. And my first question, I want to start by discussing the engagement which occurred when we created that report. So I'm going to ask my first question to Scott, and I'm going to follow up to Rowan. So an important point that I want to make is that when I was reading through the recommendations, the groups made most marginal section really stood out to me, that they're underserved and face high levels of discrimination, stigma, and racism. And these groups were identified as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, immigrants, refugees, individuals who identify as members of ethnocultural, Black, and other racialized communities, 2 SLGBTQ people, people with disabilities, people experiencing houselessness, children and youth in care, people living in institutions, people involved in the criminal justice system, women, and people living in remote areas. So, Scott, I'm wondering if you can walk us through what that engagement process was like from the perspective of the National Advisory Council, specifically who was engaged, how the model worked, and what the key takeaways were that can be used to shape future engagement and report development.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So at the council, day one, we wanted to really set out to not just have consultation. I think we talked as a council on consultation. People get sick of that. If you're asked questions that the people asking already know the answers to, that wasn't what we wanted to do. So we started off year one with really a conversation. We talked about 200 people before the pandemic. The 2 weeks before the pandemic, we were on the road talking to people around what is poverty, what does poverty mean to you. That led us into a virtual. So the following year we went virtual, and we really focused on the different themes of poverty, the kind of the core underlying factors of poverty, like how homelessness and housing, food security, 2S LGBTQ. So we really broke it all up and down. So it was really the siloed approach that exists currently in a lot of systems. So this past year, so in the spring and the late winter and spring of 22, we took a cross-cutting approach. So we brought in some big themes like the social safety net, the future of work, climate change, to really engage people across the spectrum of poverty. Poverty is not one thing. Poverty is all the things, and how they interact is kind of where a lot of the people fall through the cracks, and they are made marginal or made most marginal. And that list that we have, we're really kind of true to that list. So we engaged. We sent out invitations to about 6,000 people. We had 7 sessions, and we capped the attendance at 300 per session. and all the sessions were full. We had about 200 people show up to those sessions. So about 100 people signed up and didn't show, but that's cool. We get that. People get busy. And then, but we had about 1,000 unique individuals attend all 7 sessions. From there, we heard some big themes emerge: access to benefits and programs and services, adequacy of benefits, programs and services, and discrimination, particularly racism, that enabled poverty on the spaces level. So the othering of people, having that stigma. The stigma is kind of borne by the people that have been discriminated against. So we wanted to figure out some of those things. So those groups made most marginal. So that was the first part of the engagement. The second part was establishing small group conversations with the groups that we identified in our made most marginal kind of section. And we had small group discussions with those folks, diving deeper into the access, adequacy, and discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism, all the isms, but really kind of figuring out how we can support changing the systems that enable those isms to really persist, and figuring out kind of who's benefiting from the systems as they exist now, and how do we change them for, so we can be better together, I guess.
Thanks for sharing that, Scott. And Rowan, I know that you attended the last 2 sessions. So just given your experience and knowledge, if there's anything you want to comment on from what Scott shared, as well as your own perspective, what are some takeaways that the communities you support have had following this engagement?
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I think one thing for me that comes to mind around this kind of work is the importance of removing barriers for low-income folks to participate in these important conversations. Things like access to a computer, a digital device, folks having access to reliable internet even, and the time to be able to participate in these consultations are not always possible for a lot of folks experiencing poverty. But I really believe in the value of bringing in lived experience and expertise and upholding the lived material realities of people's lives right now. And so any way we can remove barriers, be that through providing childcare, digital inclusion measures, paying folks a living wage for their expertise, providing meals, hybrid options, language translation, ASL interpretation, and other examples are really necessary to get a fulsome picture of poverty in Canada. In terms of this report, I was able to attend 2 of the sessions, which were both online, and just saw the deep value of having discussions that were that cross-sectional part that Scott was speaking of, that were inclusive of both people with lived and living expertise and experience, as well as other stakeholders in the conversation. And of course, the ability of Zoom and hybrid options to bring in all kinds of folks that aren't often able to participate in these kinds of conversations is really important. So, for people with disabilities, folks who might not be able to travel, elders and seniors, people in rural and northern communities, there's just such values in having these broader conversations that aren't siloed into our smaller niche areas of work. So that was really valuable, and I saw a lot of value in that in both the conversations I attended. Yeah, and I just think for so many people, like for gig workers, for people working multiple jobs, many families with small children, it's just so challenging to participate at this level. So yeah, I really think that when people are able to take the time to share their experiences, it's such a gift that we can really incorporate that into the work that we're doing. I also think we need to do our best to prevent any kind of tokenization or extraction of these equity deserving groups. And that's, something that can be really challenging, especially when we have timelines and deadlines and like a very colonial way of working. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily work for folks. So, I think this kind of engagement involves, building meaningful connections with people, building trust with different folks and communities, and listening to what people say and being able to build that into the work that we're doing. So I think that being able to be flexible and responsive and center people and humans in our work is so important. And so I think there was a lot of value in the kind of consultation process as it happened.
Thanks, Rowan. You mentioned the hybrid nature and how there's some Zoom calls, and I was wondering if either Scott or yourself can speak to any barriers that people had accessing technology and maybe what you saw as solutions to enable their participation. I
can hop back in quickly and then pass it back to Scott. access to affordable and reliable internet is still a huge issue. I know, I'm speaking from the BC context, but I'm sure it exists in other communities across, other territories and provinces. But yeah, digital inclusion and digital justice is still a huge barrier for a lot of folks. Internet is very expensive. Devices are very expensive. A lot of people don't have access. We work with a lot of unhoused folks, for example, and it's really hard to hang on to a device if you're living on the streets or living outside in public spaces. So, one thing that I've seen work really well is there's some digital inclusion hubs that I've seen in different areas that allow people to connect with devices, which is really an important and useful skill, especially nowadays when so many resources are available online. And even things like accessing benefits, often you need to be able to go in and log in online. And for many people that don't have the device, the internet access, and then also the digital skills and tools you need to actually implement those things. So I think there's still, a big barrier in terms of people being able to access digital spaces. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, thanks. With the digital question, I'm in total agreement. There's the access is one thing, but also availability. There's a lot of communities in the country that don't have reliable internet. Yesterday, we heard a story about that people weren't able to get released, with an ankle bracelet from incarceration because there was no internet service in their home community. So they actually kept them in the prison system because there was no internet. And we heard stories also last year of during the pandemic of parents that had to park in the McDonald's parking lot for the day with their kids, some kids on phones, on borrowed phones, some kids on laptops, or so that they're able to go to school. But they couldn't afford internet, they didn't have reliable service, so they would use the internet where they could. But for four kids in a car all day probably isn't the best learning environment. I think we need to figure out how to do this better as a country. But also, I think we need to have stuff that's online, but I think that the human contact means a lot. And so this year, and I'm proud to say that year one, we're fully face-to-face. Year two, we were fully hybrid. Year three, we're hybrid as well. Or just just totally virtual. But this year, we're actually back face-to-face meetings. So we had meetings in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal 2 weeks ago, and this week we're in Vancouver and Regina. So we're talking to people face to face, and really deepening those relationships, because there's stuff you can get a lot of information, you can make a lot of connections, you get to get a wide swath of people online, but actually sitting across from somebody or sitting beside someone while they tell you their experience of poverty and what they think the solutions are, it's a lot different. And so we hope to weave that into the tone of our report. But if we can't get these, because a lot of folks that we get talked to the last 3 days may or may not have reliable internet access, may not have a device, may not have the time. We heard a lot of people, they're kind of like sharking. They keep moving all the time because they're in survival mode. So if you're in survival mode, you don't want to have time to sit down, dedicate an hour or an hour and a half to a conversation online about poverty in the country, because you're trying to figure out where you're going to eat next and where you're going to sleep tonight. So I think that there's a couple questions there.
Thanks, Scott and Rowan, for that. I think it's really important that when we're doing community work, we're listening to the needs of the community and what those barriers are, and just being really flexible and responsive. So when people, maybe they need to meet virtual, they need to meet in person, and having the ability to flex, be hybrid, will really enable the most access to that conversation for everyone. We've talked a lot about some barriers already, but the next question that I had was still on the topic of barriers. So in the context of systemic barriers, Rowan, from the impact that equity deserving groups are seeing, what is stopping their full participation? And just, I guess, talk about your experience working within community.
Sure, happily. Yeah, there's just so many barriers. racism is still really real. Gender-based violence, ableism, colonization, and other systems of power continue to target and make marginal communities who often experience higher rates of poverty. So in my work with the Poverty Reduction Coalition, we engage with a wide range of stakeholders in the BC context, from lone single parents, seniors, people on income and disability assistance, unhoused people, people who've been impacted by floods, forest fire, smoke. There's been a lot of climate catastrophes in British Columbia the past few years. Folks who do sex work are often ineligible for things like the CERB payments, as well as other folks in gray economies. And there's just so many barriers for all of these groups of people. I think the pandemic also harmed and continues to harm and create just very isolating conditions for a lot of folks, including, seniors, young people, people who experience gender-based violence, disabled people, migrant workers, and queer folks like myself. So huge barriers really do exist still. And then I think also, the opioid poison drug supply crisis has really hit people who use drugs, their communities, our families, and many service providers and people in the nonprofit sector in really difficult and challenging ways, which intersect with all of these other barriers in complex and nuanced ways that I think have profound impact on people's ability to sort of participate. So many barriers exist still, and I think it's always kind of amazing when people are able to kind of engage. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to create the conditions in which people are able to have better access.
Thanks, Rowan. And Scott, in follow-up, in terms of equity and engagement, what are you hearing from people with lived and living experience?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of appreciation for actually holding the space and creating the space to engage. That it doesn't always happen. So I think that if you were made invisible by the statistics, or you're not being represented in any of the data, and then you're also not being consulted or have a conversation or have any access to the people that are influencing some of those systems, then it's you feel doubly invisible. So I think that there's a part of it, and the process is interesting. So every group is a little bit different, but there's a period when they vent about about their situation currently, and then they're really pragmatic about what they need for supports, what they're going through, how appreciative they are for the supports they're getting, and if we can figure out how to do these things better and really center our policy development and on the voices and the experience of the people that they're sharing as expertise, then we can actually support a more universal approach to a lot of the. I think that Justin had said poverty. I see poverty reduction because it's reducing poverty, but poverty eradication is obviously the ultimate goal. So but if we don't get everybody involved, then that's going to be more difficult. And getting to people that are actually experiencing the discrimination, the lack of access, the unaffordability of housing. We've heard for the past, the past 3 weeks of these engagements, and how much pressure that's putting on everything else. So it's really interesting to get and on top of any other intersections that the individual already has. And people are complex, and people aren't individuals. They are individuals. They have individual issues. They have individual challenges with existing systems. So if we think of poverty as the individual experience of a systemic inequity, then we can start to say, okay, now what systems are kind of preying on these individuals, and how do we stop that? How do we alter the system? And then the first choice is, well, let's talk to the people that are being impacted most by the system, and then see how the system's impacting them, and then really try to unpack that with the system itself and say, okay, well, the person's fine, the person's deserving, the person's a human, and deserves all the rights and privileges that they have, and probably more power. But the system is meant to serve the person and not the other way around.
Thanks, Scott. I had a great conversation with a group here in Alberta about Black health equity, and they were looking at unaffordable housing and how it impacts, kids and their access to food security and how that impacts their education pathway, mental health. There's just so many outcomes from one area that people are having barriers. There are some good conversations happening in the chat. I do want to remind you, if you have questions, please use the Q&A. It's just easier for me to track the questions when we get to that portion. There was one on the digital hubs that Rowan talked about. So is there a list that people can access digital hubs? And maybe we could send that in follow-up.
There is. I was sort of searching for it while I was talking, but I couldn't find it on first glance, but I have one somewhere. So I will definitely send it for follow-up material.
Okay, and we'll be sure to get that to today's participants. Thank you. So we're going to move into our last question, and this is about takeaways. So what are tangible takeaways or actions that either of you would like to leave with the audience, and how they can apply a trauma-informed and culturally relevant approach to their work? The National Advisory Council created an infographic with 5 report recommendations, and we'll be putting a link to that infographic in the chat. And those recommendations were: reduce poverty for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, establish an income floor above the official poverty line, reduce poverty by 50% by 2030 for populations made most marginal to poverty, early intervention and prevention of child and youth poverty, and increase awareness of access to availability of government supports. So yeah, Scott, I guess we'll go to you, but what are some of those trauma-informed and culturally relevant approaches that we can take?
Yeah, I think the very first and table stakes is show up, meet people where they are, listen, be curious, be respectful, non-judgmental. There's these things that we just have to, when we're talking to people, we need to talk to them like they're people. And that sounds really simple, but showing up and I think that a lot of the conversations I've been in the last few weeks, I think there's an empathy to the situation, because you're not living the other person's situation. So I think that we have to be empathetic and listen and then seek to understand. And we listen to understand and not to reply. I think that's also a nice piece of it. If we can figure out how to listen better, then we can learn. And when we learn, we can do. And then if we can learn better, then we can do better. And then I think that starts us on a nice kind of prototype model of let's do better and then learn more, and do better than learn more. And I think that's where we move towards it. But also we have to start caring about each other. Takeaways from the piece was that oftentimes, like, the number of people in Canada, say it's 9, there's 1 in 12 people live in poverty in Canada now with the new stats, and that was in 2020. I don't think that's the same stats are accurate now. But the 11 have to care about the 1. And we can't just, hope that the 1 takes care of themselves and then works in the factories and or stocks the shelves or does all the things that we're not paying them enough to do, so that we can continue living the way that we think we should or we deserve. The 12 have to care about the whole 12. And so I think that as a foundation, as a takeaway, and that sounds kind of really simplified, but I think if we started caring about and for each other more and listening to the people that are living this situation, then we will be further ahead on how to solve it with the people and not to the people or for the people. I think we need to do it with and by the people that are living the situation or live in the experience of poverty, and really give them the controls of where we go next and how we support them best. Rowan, sorry. Taking over.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I'll sort of build on that answer as well. We speak with folks and work alongside people with lived expertise all the time who have these wonderful, great progressive solutions to the challenges that they're facing in their lives. And so I really echo that sentiment that we should be, centering these people and their leadership in these conversations. In British Columbia, the shelter rate is still $375 a month for people on income assistance and disability, and those rates are still well below the poverty line. And I think people saw that when CERB happened, CERB was set at $2,000, and the poverty line, and the rates that people are getting on income assistance and disability are below that rate. And so I think a lot of people are just experiencing a profound sense of dehumanization and stigma around sort of the realities of their lives, and feel really trapped. And, we know that poverty is not a choice. Nobody sits down and decides to become impoverished. There are real structural barriers for people. And so I think that question around not just reducing poverty, but eliminating poverty, like the solutions are out there. We have really progressive policy suggestions that could be implemented. And we can eliminate poverty if we're able to sort of collectively put our wise minds towards that goal. And so I do feel a lot of hope when I'm speaking with people with lived expertise, because oftentimes they're able to say, like, build affordable housing, raise the rates. Like, it's not a huge, like, there are complicated issues for sure, but I do feel that there's a lot of room for improving our society and building healthier, caring systems that do humanize people and treat them as humans, with not just access to their basic needs being met, but also things like dignity, which, have a profound impact on people's feelings about themselves and their worlds. And so I think that, we know some things work really well. We know some things don't work really well. And so leaning into the things that do, and again, like going back to leading with those who are most made marginal, and their perspectives and their strong leadership and championing of the things that they want to see changed is really important. So I'll stop there. I could talk about this for a long time, but I will pause.
Thanks. I think the last question that I want to address, and either of you can jump in on this one, is we have these national recommendations, and for people on the call, many of them are working within communities. So how do we take those national recommendations and apply them at the local level?
Yeah, I think that's where the impact lies, right? I think that we can make these recommendations for the country, but how they're applied and how they're realized is the most important piece. So recommendation 1 is really about so the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis poverty reduction, poverty elimination. What's behind that is that there's already been work done. There's already calls to action, and there's always calls for justice. Let's implement those. And there's also how do we enable and co-create and poverty solutions, not for, but with and by First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples. Income floor. So then you can start thinking about how do you combine living wage? How do you combine a reasonable minimum wage? How do you look at provincial and municipal supports that will get people further ahead? And then think about equity. How do you adjust your measurements and your measures of success so that the groups that are furthest behind, they're able to see the same equity in application of those goals. Child and youth prevention. I think it's not the easiest one, but most provinces have a child and youth advocate or a similar body. How do we start leveraging those behaviors? How do we change the systems that impact children and put them into poverty, and that are fraught with racism around apprehending of kids, taking kids away from the family because of poverty that's viewed as neglect? How do we kind of start to have a better conversation and a better a trauma informed? So we don't want to cause trauma and put kids into a system that's going to put them back into poverty in 10 years. Or 20 years or 10, or like whatever the time in there in care. But the pathway from care to poverty is very direct. So if we can skip that part of it and move to let's support the families that are struggling initially, then that would be part of it. And the last one is around auto filing. So can we make our programs and services and the offerings we have to help support people living in poverty more accessible more easy to use, more low barrier? Can we actually get the services out the door to the people that can use them, and not just have them as an offering that's never used and underutilized? And we're trying to say, well, these people are hard to serve or hard to reach. But I think it's a lot of the programs and services are hard to access and or hard to reach or unknown. So if we have programs, let's use them. But yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Thanks, Scott. So how do we look at barriers, not only in the system, but also in our programs and services and the barriers we're creating? Rowan, did you have anything you wanted to add about applying to the local level?
A couple of things. I'll keep it brief because I know we want time for questions, but I do think, pieces around like a living wage, for example, for families is really important. Universal pharmacare program, advocating for the Canada Disability Benefit to target deep disability poverty that exists all across Canada right now. Indigenous land sovereignty over water and territories is really important for land stewardship. Providing queer and gender nonconforming people with better resources that are, sort of tailored to meet their needs. I think there's a lot of ways that we can be implementing, reduce, as Scott said, reducing the barriers to access and providing services that actually meet the needs of the communities that are most marginal. I can speak more, but yeah, I'll leave some time for questions.
All right, well, thank you for engaging in that formal part of the Q&A. We don't have time for all of the questions, but I'm going to pick some of them out. So the first one is Justin, and he's from Treaty 6. And the question is, how do we move the conversation and collective view of poverty to eliminating poverty and not reducing poverty? It implies that some poverty is unavoidable and or is deserved, but nobody deserves to be in poverty, and we have access to the resources to make it happen. Either of you can jump in on these ones.
Yes. I think that's the easiest. I think that by having that conversation, I think we have to start somewhere. And I think that the sustainable development goal that our poverty reduction goal was established on is a 50% reduction in poverty. And when I think of that 50% reduction in poverty, I think it's a good start. And if we get to the 50% reduction in poverty, maintain the same level of resourcing, then we'll have twice as much resources for the next 50. The harder to move the people that have been and are stuck in intergenerational poverty because of the systems that have entrapped them. And so I think that there's a part of it that we need to, obviously poverty has to go down to get eliminated. So I think it's just a continuum, but I think a great question and a great framing. Thanks, Justin.
All right, thanks, Scott and Justin, for that question. The next question I'm going to ask is from Angela. When Canada reports that we've moved so many people out of poverty since the launch of 2019 national strategy, how is that being measured? So
the national strategy launched in 2018. The three big pieces of the strategy were setting a goal, establish and measure, and then having oversight. And so the goal is 50% reduction in poverty based on the Canada Income Survey data, but and the measure is actually the MacAfee measure, which is Canada's official poverty line. And it has 53 different regions across the country. And we see how that poverty goes down. It's measured annually with the Canada Income Survey. And then the council's role is to report on the progress. So that's kind of how the measurement happens. But there's a dashboard of 12 indicators, 6 that are, mind you, all the indicators are only proxy measures of poverty. I think we haven't figured out because I don't know if there's an actual one definition of poverty, because I think poverty is individual, that we kind of report on collectively. So I think that those are proxy measures of poverty. Income is a proxy measure, but we haven't really figured out that what you feel, if you feel included or excluded, if you feel discriminated against or the stigma. I don't think we figured those, or labeled. I think we haven't figured those pieces out yet on how to measure those.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to ask this next question to Rowan.
Good,
and
yeah, thanks.
I'm kind of curious, more at the local level, this question's from Sid. What is being done to engage political and bureaucratic policymakers in understanding and thinking through the implications of consultation data for policy? So how are you seeing policymakers being engaged in this process from someone that is working locally?
Sure. Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So at the Poverty Reduction Coalition, a big part of our work right now is engaging people with lived and living experiences and trying to connect those people with local decision makers and policymakers to sort of bring that perspective and that expertise into conversations around the policy changes that are happening. And that's been really quite beautiful work to see how, bringing folks together in a room that might not have access to each other can have really interesting impacts and outcomes in terms of policy building. So I think that that is one sort of tactic that we're using to try to build capacity in people with lived experience and living experience to sort of come up with and communicate their solutions and have impact in terms of the local level policy that's happening. I'm just going to read the question again because I feel like I missed part of it.
What is being done to engage political and bureaucratic policymakers in understanding and thinking through the implications of consultation data for policy?
I'm not sure I have anything much more to add about that. Scott, do you have anything you want to add in about that?
I think that the more we can connect individuals that are living the experience of poverty to share their expertise with policymakers, decision makers, I think the closer that link is, and the more human that connection is between those two groups, the easier it is for government to make those decisions. The council seeks to provide public cover for political courage. And I think we need political courage, and some that starts with talking to people that are living the experience.
Thank you. We are flying through these questions, which is great. So the next question is from Amani, and it's: could the National Advisory Council on Poverty influence, push, or support Bill C22, the Canada Disability Benefit Act?
Yeah, so that's definitely on our radar. We've talked to the group before it was passed, and then because I think that, and we're in close connection with Canada with our Disability Without Poverty, to make sure, and they're working on the details. And I think that's where the important piece will be. But the one thing that we've heard a lot is to make sure that the provinces don't claw back what's given. And so that those kind of understandings are built in before, and that there's no losers for this, and it should actually improve the situation of people living in poverty with a disability, and hopefully move them out of poverty. Because I think that's the goal. Because and I think that the process that they've done to get C22 passed unanimously in the House of Commons was pretty impressive. And so kudos to all the groups that have worked and kind of really got together and figured out how we can do this together. And then they got it done. Now figuring out the details on how it can really improve the lives of people is the key.
All right, thank you.
Just chime in quickly if that's okay. Yeah, I think the answer to that question is yes. This issue of a targeted base income for folks who are experiencing deep poverty, and we know that people who experience disability are in very low brackets in terms of poverty. And so, the Canada Disability Benefit is a big, exciting bill, but I think, as Scott kind of said, so much needs to be determined about how that will interact with provincial benefits. Will there be clawbacks? Clawbacks already currently exist on a lot of the benefits. So I think there's still a lot of big question marks about the bill and how that will actually come to be and come to impact people's lives. But I do absolutely think this report has a role in terms of advocating for that benefit to proceed, and in a good way where people with disabilities are consulted and their perspectives are put into that bill. And I also think that the issue of, who will be eligible would be a big question coming up about how that will proceed.
Great. This kind of leads us into the next question from Daniel. So in New Brunswick, Daniel did a project about deep poverty. Those who are left behind by current targeted initiatives are single people without kids and who are below 65. Daniel sees basic income is recommended in the report, but that seems to not be getting off the ground in Canada. Are there any other ideas about targeted income supplementation heard at the consultations? And I'm just going to put the link that Daniel shared in the chat for everyone as well.
Yeah, that single unattached group in Canada makes up a big portion of people living in poverty. I think that there's some, stigma or bias that if you're single, you can just get a job and you'll be fine.
That's not the case. And so I'm interested to see how much of that group gets supported through the disability benefit. And because I think that's playing a part of it. But there still be people that aren't able to find the work that they can do in the place that they are. We hear a lot about this, high rates of poverty and high rates of job vacancies. And it's not just you can't just put those things together, because the people aren't in the same places and the people don't have the same skills to have those jobs. So I think that if you want to talk to Maitri or Canada, or Community Food Centers of Canada, then I think they've got an interesting approach that we've heard this year around a working age supplement or benefit. And I think that's it's worth a closer look and some consideration. So figuring something out that group only gets HST-GST as a benefit in our country, how do we handle that? Because it's not fair to make people wait till you're 65 to not be living in poverty because we get this OAS, GIS, and CPP, and that seems kind of just cruel.
I would also
Thanks,
just
Scott.
add, oh, sorry.
I was going to pass it to you, Rowan. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the BC government did a BC income report panel. That's quite interesting and worth checking out. So I'll pop that in the chat as a resource for folks.
Thanks, Rowan. This one is on digital inclusion. Again, we did touch on this a bit earlier. Do you have suggestions for how to get the word out about consultation opportunities to folks that face barriers to digital inclusion? I find that our default recruitment strategies tend to be very online based, and we miss folks, of course. So maybe speak about how we did that through the report, and then ways that we can improve on the future.
Yeah, I think that our access as a national council to people on the ground is limited, just because we don't have your phone number or your connection. We don't know you, but we do know the groups that provide service and support. And so when we send our invitations, we invite those groups to invite other people in. And I think that's kind of a front line, because it's coming from a trusted source. And oftentimes a support organization can organize a way to connect. So with our individual conversations about poverty with those groups that were made most marginal, that's how we did it. We went through organizations that sought out their membership or their supports with the individuals in their communities and brought them into a place where we were able to interact.
I think public libraries have really been an asset for us in terms of just librarians are fantastic at helping people find resources. I know we rely a lot on like word of mouth or people telling their friends or telling other people in their communities, because, for folks that don't have access, it is such a challenge for, nonprofits are often so under-resourced. We may not have time to go out and do outreach and things like that. And then I think the other thing that, we rely on a lot is just building relationships over time. Like, we don't expect that we'll suddenly have access to a whole bunch of folks. It sometimes takes a longer time and longer lead up in order to like build those relationships and foster them and build the trust it takes to sort of ask things of folks. So I think that just being patient and doing the work at a pace that makes sense for people that are receiving information is also really important.
Thank you. I learned about all the services library has during the pandemic and was really surprised. And I'm such an advocate of the libraries here in Edmonton now because of it. And it's probably the same across Canada. So I'm going to try and squeeze time for two more questions. One is from Mariah. Many of these community level supports and provincial income supports mentioned as poverty alleviation tools do not apply to First Nations living on reserve. How can the National Poverty Reduction Strategy or National Advisory Council better address the actual challenges First Nations face on reserve?
And yeah, what a great question. I think the nation-to-nation relationship of First Nations to the federal government is important. How we some of the things that in the report would suggest that auto filing of taxes. Tax filing in First Nations is slow, understandably, but oftentimes with tax filing comes benefits and services. How do we, and poverty, and I think that there's right now they're working on an actual measure of poverty for First Nations, because the kind of colonial version of what poverty is doesn't actually make sense in many contexts, because you're not poor if you have access to the stuff, or you don't, and you don't see yourself as poor. I think that term is kind of awful. I think it really talks to, it's a stigma and a label that's put on people that kind of really undermines their humanity. It kind of others them. And so, but with First Nations, I think we just need to talk and get engaged and figure out how we can, nation to nation, support while they, for themselves, build their poverty reduction strategy, and we can help build capacity along the way.
Okay.
But you're right.
Scott, thank you for that. And Rowan.
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak briefly to this. I think that, my understanding is that many on reserve communities still don't have access to clean drinking water. I think that, that becomes very difficult to move the conversation forward without kind of the basic needs being met of the community. And so that's one that I think so much more work needs to be done around. I think also issues like heating and cooling for communities, access to internet. There's just so many challenges that are unique to on reserve communities that we really need to do a better job of addressing collectively. And again, like leading with leadership that comes from First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples has to be integral to the work that we're doing, and urgent, because these are, we're living in a wealthy nation. And, I think that question around elimination versus reduction, like we live in a wealthy country, and we do absolutely have the power to eliminate poverty if we are able to muster the political will and put in robust policies. And so, yeah, I do think that this is a huge issue nationwide that needs to be addressed urgently.
Thank you. I see Mariah put their email in the chat as well to continue this conversation.
Oh, awesome.
I know in the disabilities community, nothing about us without us. And I feel the same with Indigenous communities, is that it needs to be driven from the community, and frontline workers, government, everyone else is just there to support and provide those resources, connections that can help eliminate poverty in Indigenous communities. This next question, we're going to keep it really brief. It's from Jenny. And Jenny's been working on poverty-related work for 40 years. The federal government in 1991 to end child and family poverty by 2000. It was a goal that wasn't met. We're now in 2022, and it seems that Canada is facing the worst poverty-related situations. So, Rowan, what gives you hope?
Honestly, what gives me hope is working with people experiencing poverty and seeing the hope that they have, and the belief that they have that things can be better, and the lives that they build for themselves, even when given just really limited choices in their lives. They're really, truly, hardworking people that are doing their best and believe in a better life. And that gives me a lot of hope that we're going to be able to confront these issues. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of good work being done. Also seeing organizations, seeing people, seeing families, seeing communities, seeing land defenders, like people are out there doing really good work. And I think that brings me a lot of hope and a lot of joy.
Thanks, Rowan. And how about you, Scott?
Yes. No, I think that the hopeful nature of the people that that are in the situation, I think that's very hopeful. We saw possibility with the CERB and what that could look like and how that can help out. I think that the people that are really connecting on an individual level with others to share, to make their lives better, how we can be better together. There's great work going on in this country. There's no doubt. It's sometimes it's big and sometimes it's small, and but it's inspiring to see what people can do when they care enough to act. And so that gives me hope that people are gonna, if people keep caring about and for each other, then we'll be all right. But if we do it nationwide, then we could be great. And so I think that gives me hope. I think that our access to the system of policymakers and how that they can be influenced, and how that they want good things for Canada as well. But I think we need to figure out how we can support the policy to be well written and to be thought out, and to really take into consideration the people living in poverty, also those that support them on the ground level. I saw a comment there, but stakeholders do great work, and we need to figure out how to support those groups at the same time. But it's a big, huge, complex place and a landscape of people that are trying to do good work for people that need the support, and people that need the support are able to influence that good work. And so I think I'm pretty hopeful anyway, but yeah, it all gives me hope.
Thank you. Our time together is drawing near an end, so I want to thank Scott and Rowan for joining us for today's conversation. I know there's a few unanswered questions. We'll be definitely sharing Scott's contact information. We'll check with Rowan about sharing Rowan's. And I know that I have a lot to reflect on myself after today's conversation. One thing I heard was that listen to learn and not reply. Just a great reminder. When we listen to learn, that's how we really understand the barriers that people are facing and that they all have unique needs, and that we really need to center our policy development on voices of those with lived and living experience. And that's how we achieve the best results. And we need to all be working together. I just want to remind everyone that Giving Tuesday is coming up on Tuesday, November 29th, and it's a day to celebrate the power of people to come together and drive change in their communities. As a member of the Tamarack community, we're hoping that you'll celebrate with Tamarack. So since 2018, we've had the Be a Light Fund, and it supported 400 individuals with lived and living experience to access paid workshops, gatherings, and master classes at Tamarack. Maureen, if you could put the link to that fund in the chat. So whether or not you're in a financial position to contribute, I really encourage you to check out this fund, share it with people that might be missing out on learning opportunities, that could be applying to access some of the paid offerings we have. And if you are in a financial position, consider donating to it during Giving Tuesday. And we also have upcoming webinars and learning opportunities. So Maureen's going to put up some slides. But on November 30th, we have our Director of Deepening Community, Heather Keem, will be sitting down with Kim Samuel, the author of On Belonging, Finding Connection in the Age of Isolation. And the conversation will explore Kim's book on belonging in the crisis of social isolation and the fundamental human need to belong. And then if you could advance to the next slide. On December 7th, our co-CEO of our Learning Center, Liz Weaver, will be joined in conversation with Sylvia Chu, who is Tamarack's Consulting Director for Collective Impact, to discuss, do we know the problem we're trying to solve? That conversation will explore navigating diverse perspectives when working in collaboration with others, using the CINIFIN framework as a tool to coming to a shared agreement on the nature of the problem that you are solving. And next slide. In a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, the infographic, including the top 5 recommendations, as well as learning opportunities that I've mentioned. Feel free to go to tamarackcommunity.ca to check out those learning opportunities. And thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks.